A free press, often cited as an essential pillar of democracy. But what if there's no press at all? A news desert is a place, rural or urban, with no access to credible and comprehensive news. You might think such a place would be rare in the world's biggest economy, but you'd be wrong. Of the 3,143 counties in the United States, more than half, 1,766, that's that light blue color on your screen, have either no local news source or only one remaining outlet. There are 204 counties indicated in white with no local news outlet at all. Since 2005, the U.S. has lost nearly 2,900 newspapers. During that time, the country has lost two-thirds of its newspaper journalists, or 43,000. There are about 6,000 newspapers remaining. The vast majority of those are weeklies. Penny Abernathy is a leading expert on the crisis. Here's what she told the Editors and Publishers show.
When you lose a reporter at a local newspaper that shut down, you've lost the person that shows up at the school board meeting, lost the person that shows up at the county commissioner meeting.
There you go.
When you lose the reporter at the state and metro papers, you're losing the investigative reporters. You're losing the beat reporters that covered education and pull together all the trends in a state.
As she was saying, these losses have profound impacts on their communities. Experts like Abernathy and many others say they could lead to an increase in corruption, irresponsible spending, decreased accountability, straight ticket voting, less competitive elections, and lower turnout. All these increases also push towards political polarization. The less information people have, the less they engage, except for the most partisan. Here's PBS's Judy Woodruff.
Do you think that our country can stay strong, that our democracy can stay strong well into the future with, frankly, hollowed out local journalism?
I worry that it can't, because I worry that we are more susceptible to this kind of tribal attitude and behavior. When the news is only sort of reminding us of those claims being made by both sides at the national level, I think it makes the problem worse.
And it's important to point out that even as Americans' trust in the news media has waned, Pew Research Center found that local news is more trusted than national news across all age groups. So, what are the effects of the crisis on civic life, and what can be done to fix them? Our guest joining us from Washington, D.C. is Sarabeth Berman. She's the CEO of the American Journalism Project. Hello to you, Sarabeth. Thank you for speaking to Scoop. First question, really, few media outlets are immune. Local journalism, legacy newspaper brands, digital natives, and entertainment conglomerates. How did we get to this crisis, and is it fair to call it a crisis?
I think it's absolutely fair to call it a crisis, and thank you so much for having me. Over the last 2 decades, we have watched this slow motion unraveling of the American newspaper industry. Advertising revenues have plummeted. They've largely moved online, and the business model has really unraveled. And what that means is that people have lost these trusted purveyors of information, the people that, as Penny Abernathy was saying, show up at the school board meetings, at City Hall, who help you understand what's happening in your community. And the research on this is very clear. The decline of local news is contributing to people's lack of consciousness about what's happening around them. It makes them less likely to show up at the voting box. It makes them less likely to engage in their communities. And it makes them more polarized, both in their voting patterns and their mindsets. What's filling the void is this spread of misinformation. People are turning to social media and cable news for a sense of identity instead of their neighbors. And what we are seeing is that there are real efforts across this country to try to revive local news and reimagine the way we finance and sustain local news in this country, not as a commercial business, but rather as civic institutions that we fund in the way we do other institutions that are essential to our communities, that help weave our communities together, like the ballet, like the opera, like museums, like libraries. And what we're seeing is this emergence of a new generation of news organizations that are calling upon individuals, calling upon philanthropy. They are still getting some advertising revenue, but they are figuring out new ways to finance local news. And importantly, they're moving away from, of course, newspapers, because people are receiving local news, they're engaging with local news, they're engaging with all their information on their devices, not on a paper that shows up on your front door every morning. And so they're delivering local news online.
Sorry, just to cut you off. Just to flesh it out, the old model would have relied about 90% on advertising and the rest coming from subscribers and such. What would this new model look like?
This new model is funded through a variety of revenue sources. One is philanthropy. There's billions of dollars of philanthropy in our country. A lot of philanthropy is tied to place. People who care about their community, Tulsa or Cleveland or Houston, and they want to help support that community. So philanthropy is an important revenue stream. Another important revenue stream are individual readers who say, you know what, I don't only want this local news because I need this information, but I understand that this is important for my neighbor to have too. So I'm going to throw in a few dollars a month and I'm going to pay for it. And then finally, we are looking to local business and who want to find audiences that care about their community and will still advertise and sponsor local news. And those are the main revenue sources. We're also seeing events working really well, live events and the opportunities for revenue that come from events. And then some of our news organizations are being really creative about what we call swag or other ways to engage their audience and to bring in some revenue sources.
Yeah, and the problem that local news is seeing, it's affected every corner of the country. But are you noticing some areas are worse hit than others?
The reality is this problem has played out all across the country. It's both a rural problem. There are communities that have no local news at all. But in our urban locations across the country where populations are growing, where they're diversifying, what we are finding is that audiences feel very underinformed. They don't know what's happening around them. They don't feel they have the information they need to engage in their communities. And often this has to do with distribution. What many of our older news sources are behind a paywall. And so people in communities feel they can't access it quickly. And yet bad information or misinformation is spreading online for free rampantly.
A lot of people are concerned about the money that might be going to fund some of these alternative news outlets, like the money that the American Journalism Project is providing. Could you tell us if there's any strings attached, any editorial requirements when they receive these grants?
There's absolutely no strings attached. The goal of these is to fund the principles of independent local journalism. And part of that principle is that journalists should follow the story where the story takes them. They should not be instructed by philanthropy or anyone else on where to spend their time and energy and their reporting resources. And so there's a strict firewall, as there always has been in American newspaper culture, which is that journalists follow the story and the funding supports that principle.
A lot of journalism being denounced in recent years. Have you run up against any sort of pressure or critics of what you're trying to do?
What we are finding is that people across this country really understand that local news that is really about their place, is something that's vitally important. You mentioned at the top of this that people trust local news much more than they trust national news. What people crave, and we see this across party lines, is people want local news about their place. They want it coming from not someone who flies in and doesn't understand their community. They want it from someone who lives in their community, who understands the dynamics in their community. And we're seeing largely a lot of energy around that.
Yeah, when we talk about philanthropic organizations, yours isn't the only one. There are a number of others as well. But are they capable of solving this journalism crisis on their own? This is a industry-wide problem. It's a problem that
has been playing out over a generation. And I think it will take a generation to rebuild local news. But I think philanthropy does have an important role to play. And that really is because this is a market failure. When the market can't provide something, philanthropy is an important tool that we have to revitalize local news. It should not be entirely funded by philanthropy, and it doesn't have to be entirely funded by philanthropy. But philanthropy can play a critical role in helping us bridge from the old way that we received local news through American newspapers to a new generation of news organizations that are digital, that are building these new revenue streams, and that are providing local news in the way that people need it for now and for the future. And so we do have a lot of confidence that philanthropy can play a very important role. And it's also worth saying that we think public policy has an important role to play. The United States far underspends in terms of government dollars on the public square, on the press, compared to other modern democracies. And so we think there is a role for smart public policy that is completely editorially independent, but helps uphold this vital pillar of our democracy.
Right, part of a wider solution. Sarabeth, thank you very much for your time. You're doing important work there. And that brings us to our quote of the day. It comes from the John Nichols, who calls for a Marshall Plan to save American journalism. Writing in The Nation last December, he said, quote, "Turning the tide will require a level of investment that billionaires and philanthropies are never going to make." As Sarabeth was saying, Germany, for instance, funds public media at a rate of $142.42 per person. The United States, by comparison, spends $3.16 per person per year. We've got to recognize that the news desert is now nationwide. Providing the resources that are needed to make it blossom anew is essential for saving democracy. That's it for this edition of Scoop. Thank you for watching. Please stay tuned to France 24.